Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right. So, good morning. Happy Friday. We're at the very end of September, and next Tuesday we're already October. So, thanks for joining me for contract class. We're going to be discussing the true meaning of seller concession. I believe that there's still a lot of misconceptions and understanding around concessions. We have to take out of our vocabulary, commissions. Okay, commissions, right? Now it's about concessions, with all of the changes that have transpired through NAR. And it's something that we've been talking about, gosh, for months and months and months. Now that they have eliminated and removed the compensation, right, from the MLS, now we have to, have a written agreement with the buyer and written agreement with the buyer stipulating that the buyer is responsible to pay us consideration for concessions or commissions, right? And then ultimately navigating that and asking the listing agent and the seller if they're willing to pay us, monetary concessions, right? So how do we navigate that, right? So I was able to provide some information straight from the California Association of Realtors, and we'll tap into how to navigate this, but more so the compensation when it comes to the SBBP form as well, and the importance when submitting the offer, right? So, you guys ready to get started? All right, let's do this. All right. And if you're on Zoom, please make sure to mute yourself, please. If you need to make a call or anything, you just don't need the sound of your voice. Okay, so please make sure you mute yourself. All right, so in the running up of the NAR settlement implementations, a lot of the MLSs have adopted a feel where now it says seller concessions, right? If you've had a listing and inputted the listing on the MLS, now there's a section on the beginning part of the MLS that allows you to say either the seller is willing to consider concessions. You have the option to say yes, the option to say no, or you can leave it blank as well and not have an option, right? Because remember, now concessions is a negotiating tool, right? And it's no difference, ladies and gentlemen, similar to a request of repairs, okay? A request of repairs, right? Buyer does their due diligence, right? Gets inspections, general inspections, home inspection, sewer inspection, electrical inspections, and now gathers all of the reports, right? And now provides this as part of their negotiations. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're asking for you to either repair it, replace it, give us credit, or do a price reduction, right? Those are some of the conditions, right, a buyer can submit. Now, a submission doesn't guarantee anything, right? Because at the end of the day, seller is selling the in in his as-is condition. Okay. So meaning is the seller doesn't even have to entertain, right? Well, guess what? Compensation now is the same thing. It's a negotiation tool now, right? And now is because the MLS has eliminated the amount that you can make. Now we have to now submit a request similar to a request of repairs. So I want to distinguish one from the other because I believe that both are similar in characteristics when it comes to negotiating, right? The ultimate goal is, right, is for us to get what the buyer's needs and wants is, right? If the buyer feels that there's a lot of repairs to it, right? Here it is. I want, $5,000, $10,000 of consideration, right? And then we'll submit the request of repairs and then hope and pray that the seller comes back with a good response, right? But the seller can come back and the seller has three positions that they can do. The seller can say, yeah, you know what? I'm willing to. The house is a little rundown, in consideration. Let's go ahead and give them the 5,000 or the $10,000 of credit. You know what? Let's do a combination of both. Let me give you 5,000 and I'll take care of some of the items that you're requesting, right? So that's option two. Or if it's significant, then the seller can also says, look, in regards to doing any repairs, giving credit, let's just go ahead and reduce the price. And that can be the option as well, right? So I want you to understand the meaning of negotiations when it comes to requests of repairs. Now have that mindset and the ability that now that's going to be now your position when it comes to consideration of compensation. You're going to submit the offer, right? You're going to submit your pre-qualifying, you're going to submit proof of funds and all of the advisories that come in, but you're also on the purchase agreement, you're going to add a provision, which is G3, asking for the seller to pay you compensation. So the field may be simple by saying a yes or no to the box, or it may allow a listing agent to input a specific percentage of dollar amount members are advised to check with the MLS. Now, in essence, the way CRMLS works is it allows you right now to say yes or no or leave it blank. When you're ready to close the deal, right? Congratulations, you're closing the deal. Now it opens up a new percentage of checklists, right? It'll say something like, you know, what is the concession going to? Is it closing costs? If it's for request of repairs for improvements. And there's also a section there for compensation to the broker as well. So now it has different categories, but that's more towards the end. When you put the property from active to under contract to pending and eventually sold, you're going to be able to do these modifications if there is any consideration and concessions given by the seller. And it can be one or it can be multiple things that the seller is giving concessions, right? Just like it has always been, right? In the past, it was stamped and secure that we had our commission, right? Then we would go through the escrow period, and now the buyer would submit a request of repairs, and then the seller would come back and says, "Look, we'll go ahead and give $5,000." So, in theory, if you really think about it, this has always been the same normal practice. Now it's a little bit of the reverse where we're asking now for consideration from the very beginning. Okay. And there's three things, ladies and gentlemen, that a seller can do when it comes to consideration of your commission, right? The seller can accept your term, the seller can counter your term, or the seller can reject your term. Okay. Those are the options that the seller has as well. Because if you really think about it, the buyer representation agreement says that the buyer is responsible to pay your commission. It says it in black and white. It's on the first page of the BRBC, right? In essence, the buyer is responsible, but it's how you interpret and how you deliver the document to your buyers, right? That's going to set you apart, and that's where you're going to get more buyers feeling comfortable signing these agreements. Okay, so what is seller's concessions? Okay, just think about that for a quick minute. What is seller's concessions, right? Well, Simon, I just heard you say what concessions are, right? Well, concessions can be many things, right? Concessions can be buyer's closing cost, buyer's buy down of the rate. Okay, we're buying down the rate. It can also mean request of repairs, concessions for request of repairs. And it can also be the obligation, right? The obligation to the buyer's agent. So seller concessions are seller's credit and are defined broadly as monetary payments to cover any buyer expenses, such as the cost of escrow or title, lender fees, repairs, inspections, rate buy downs, and may also include covering the obligation of the buyer to compensate their own broker, right? So the buyer can utilize the amount of money that they're getting from the seller, if any, to use it towards all of these obligations if they choose to. Okay, it's not just broker fee, but it can also be monetary for lender fees, request of repair fees, buy down of the interest rate, right? They have a 6.25, but if they put $10,000 as an example, they can reduce the rate from 6.25 to maybe 5.75, right? And what happens with the rate goes down, right? The mortgage payment also goes down, right? So they may use that for that purpose if the seller is giving concessions, okay? So I want you to distinguish one from the other, right? Because concessions is a broad word used now in real estate, okay? Any questions so far? Pretty self-explanatory, right? Awesome. All right, so where on the listing agreement does the seller commit to paying seller concessions? Okay, that's a test question. Okay, I know the answer. The question is, do you know the answer to this, right? So let's find out. So on the residential listing agreement, and that goes to even the vacant land listing agreement, and the commercial listing agreement as well, there is does not have any section to commit to seller concessions, unfortunately. Okay, there's nothing there. But the new form in the multiple listing service, the addendum, the MLSA form, okay, is attached to the listing agreement by checking 5B2 on the LSA. The seller may authorize the listing agent to advertise on the MLS that the seller will consider offering in which seller concessions are requested. I also want you to note that this box alone does not grant the listing agent authority to advertise a specific percentage or dollar amount for that. The seller must notify the broker in writing for that amount to be, okay? So let me break it down for you a little different, okay? If you've seen the listing agreement, and if you haven't, I encourage you to please look at the listing agreement, get yourself familiar with the agreement, understand the components of the listing agreement, and ask a lot of questions. You can ask me as the broker of the office. You can do some research, right? You can go to the California Association of Realtors. You can call Legal Car as well, Car Legal. You can also do a lot of stuff on YouTube, right? There's a lot of information on YouTube that you can also do. I've taught classes in the past too. You can go to our YouTube channel as well and see past the contract classes that I specifically talk about, the listing agreement. Okay. But if you know the listing agreement, there's nothing that says about compensation the buyer's broker anymore, right? The old listing agreement compared to the new listing agreement, right? The new one just says your compensation and your compensation only. But there's also another provision on there that says about a unrepresented buyer, right? That's someone that is not being represented by another agent or yourself. Okay. But that's it. It doesn't have anything else about compensating someone that brings you an offer or a ready, willing, and able buyer. Okay. That's the negotiation component to your position. Now, with that being said, the listing agreement now has additional forms. And those additional forms have the new form, the MLS or the MLSA form that says specific information about all of the changes with NAR. And it emphasizes as well under that paragraph that if the seller wishes to give consideration of concessions, then the seller will have to put it in writing. Okay. Now, nowhere, and I want to be crystal clear, nowhere on the MLS are you allowed to put a percentage. Okay. Seller is willing to give 2.5%. Not on agent remarks, not in private remarks, not on the description. The only thing that you could do is toggle the yes or no, or leave it blank, consideration from the seller. That's it. Okay. Now, let's say you have a listing and the seller says, yeah, you know what? I'm okay, allowing them to submit their request, right? And you put on the MLS, yes, they'll consider consideration of concessions, right? Now, concessions, remember, doesn't automatically in your head when you see it on the MLS, oh, they're paying commission. No, no, no. That's just a broad language that the seller may consider and give some type of monetary consideration of concessions to your buyer. But what did we say earlier in regards to what that is? It can be used for many things, right? So don't think that because it's yes, that that's all going to be your amount. The buyer has to make that ultimate decision on how they're going to navigate that amount. If it's 1%, 2%, 3% that they're giving, they may also use that as part of their closing costs. Maybe they're tight on their money, right? And they barely have the means to do so. Or they may just say, look, all of the 2.5% can be towards my obligation as the buyer to pay my agent his share or her share of the commission earned, right? So those are the segues and the understanding and how you navigate this new form. Okay. Where on the RPA can the buyer write in their request for seller to pay seller concessions? Okay. We just talked about the listing agreement, right? That nowhere on the listing agreement has anything about cooperating compensation. Let me go back even just 4 months ago, right? 4 months ago, if you saw the listing agreement, and the listing agreement used to stipulate the total commission and what the agent was willing to share with their cooperating buyer broker, meaning the total would be 5%, 6%, 4%, whatever that is, and then we would share some of the compensation we negotiated with the seller to anyone that brings us a ready, willing, and able buyer. That has been removed, right? Now the only thing is the seller's and the agent's commission. That's it. So again, going back to what I said about the three things that the seller can do is one, accept, counter, or reject. Okay. Let's say that you put a request for 3% to pay you, and the purchase price that you submitted an offer is at $1 million. Okay, 3% of $1 million is 30,000, right? Well, when the seller and the listing agent review your offer in consideration of your clients, they can say, yeah, I'm okay giving the 3%, or they can come back and counter that and says, look, we're not going to give you 3, but we'll give you 2.5%. Okay. But also remember that whatever you have on the buyer representation agreement, okay, will stipulate how much you can collect. Because if the seller is willing to give you more than what you have on your buyer representation agreement, because you don't want to scare the buyer, because you says, well, the buyer won't sign this agreement, so I have to make it look like I'm only getting 1% from the buyer, right? Then you may be in a position where the listing agent may ask for a copy of the fourth page of the BRBC form. And if it says 1%, well, that's how they're going to utilize this for negotiations. Meaning that if the listing agent and the seller see 1%, they're saying that you're okay to receive 1%. Okay. So be careful in how you navigate the conversations with the buyer, right? Yes, you want to be full transparent with the buyer. Yes, you want to make sure you're giving, your value proposition, but don't shortchange yourself because you're afraid that you're going to lose this buyer. Okay. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, you want to be paid what you're worth. What is it going to be to work with the buyer through 30 days of up and down, maybe hit some challenges, hit some walls? There's a lot that a buyer does or a buyer agent does, right? It's not that easy, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts to a buyer's agent position. So one of them is, just looking at properties, then calling to see if they're available, then setting appointments to show, then spending some time, right, to go and see 5 to 6 homes, and that's half a day of your time. And then ultimately, wanting the buyer to submit an offer on a specific property, right? But then you're at that cusp right here is like, oh man, I don't know what I'm going to be paid, right? Because the seller may come back and say, no compensation. And we're hearing now more and more sellers that are not paying concessions. And that's just the nature of what we're facing right now. Okay. So in essence, the buyer would have to make an executive decision if how they want to approach it. Yes, as I mentioned, you want to give yourself the highest amount so that way you don't have to go back and forth. There's ways that you can negotiate this, but in essence, I'd rather start high so that way if the seller comes back, at least I started high instead of low. Because if I start low, then they may just accept a lower commission, right? And if you're that individual agent has been spending weeks and weeks and weeks on your weekends, on evenings, showing properties, that amount that you thought you're going to make will probably be reduced because if you break down what you would earn on a commission on an hourly basis, that may be very small, right? So you got to look at the bigger picture. Now let's go into the RPA, right? Where on the RPA does that information say? So, all right, so there are two places in 3G1 of the RPA, and the seller agrees to credit the buyer for closing costs as a default, or in 3G3, the seller agrees to pay the buyer's obligation to compensate their own broker. All right. Most of us are going to check 3G3, right? You check it, and then that populates the SBPP form, right? That is the request that we're asking the listing agent and the seller for consideration to pay us compensation. Okay. If the seller has authorized the listing agent to advertise on the MLS that the seller is willing to consider concessions and to specify an exact amount, it is now binding on the seller when the buyer makes their offer, right? So in essence, and I want to caution you, but I also want to be very transparent with you on this, right? Because nowhere on the MLS can you say a percentage, right? You can't say seller is willing to offer 2.5 to anyone that brings us a, offer at or above, right? But you can't say concessions is, yes, the seller is willing to consider concessions. But the essence of all of this, and again, just full transparency, is what if the buyer agent, okay, what if the buyer agent calls you and says, ring, ring, hi, this is Simon over at KW. The property over on 123 ABC, is that property still available? I see that in the MLS it's active. Yeah, it's available. When are offers due? Okay. Well, all offers are due Monday by 5 p.m. Wonderful. Do you have any offers? Yeah, we have several offers. Are there at or above? We have some at and we have some above. Okay. Is the seller considering concessions? Yeah, the seller is considering concessions. Do we know the percentage of that concessions? Well, submit your request and I will present it to the seller. Okay. Did I say a percentage? No. Okay. I just gave them, the information that they requested, right? The information was, yeah, the seller will consider concessions. And I also said, please submit your request because we don't know. And remember, you got to play the poker game, right? Because in your mind, you're thinking they may be saying 3%. Okay. But in essence, they may only be submitting 1%, right? But as soon as you spill the beans and say 2.5%, then they're going to put 2.5%. Then you're not doing best for your client, okay, your seller. Because they may come back and say they only won 1% because the buyer is paying a percentage as well. Does that make sense? Right? Because you don't know, the buyer may have the means to pay, right? This is why when you're sitting down with the buyer, you're looking at their financials. So tell me a little bit of what we're planning to do here. Well, we want to put 20%. Okay, so based on the loan amount, based on the purchase of price, based on the down payment, based on the closing costs, do they also have an additional funds to include a commission? Because that's the conversation you need to be having moving forward with all of your buyers. Okay. And you can incorporate that as part of their closing cost. So when you're talking to the buyer, you're also talking to the lender. And you could say to the lender, please incorporate, 2%, 2.5%, because that is going to be the buyer's responsibility. And that's okay. Now, when the lender breaks down the estimate to bring to the table, right? They're looking at the purchase price, they're looking at the closing costs, they're looking at the down payment, and they're also looking at your compensation of 1, 2, 3%. And then they'll know, okay, this is the amount of money that I need to bring in, the down payment, the closing costs, and the additional compensation, right? That's a normal conversation now moving forward that you need to be having with your buyers. Okay. Well, Simon, what if I don't have the means? I'm barely making it. If it's a FHA, right? Minimum 3.5% down payment, and they may need some assistance, right? Okay, I get it. But also the buyer representation agreement, there's a category that says about financial obligations. And it says there, does the buyer have the means to pay me compensation? If the answer is no, you're going to check it. If the answer is maybe, okay, then you uncheck it, you leave it blank. But there's also a different category there that says about if it's a special type of loan, like a VA loan, right? Where a lender on a VA loan, there's very little, if not none, fees that the buyer pays. And that includes compensation. Okay. How do you navigate that? Right. So then you have to make an executive decision, right? In the mind, you're thinking, well, I'm going to try to collect it from the seller. And that's a good mindset to have because that's the normal that it used to be, right? It was never a issue because we would see it on the MLS, the amount of compensation. Okay. So when having the conversation with the buyer, that's exactly what you're going to say. Look, my ultimate goal is to try to get it from the seller. And if I'm successful enough and the seller is willing to consider it, then we're okay. We can continue. If the seller says no, and you don't have the means to pay me, I'm not going to stop the transaction. I'm going to have to pull out of this transaction. You now have to make a decision if you want to continue with this home as an unrepresented buyer. But I caution you with that and the importance of having a buyer age and represent you because they have your best interests. They're going to protect you. You know, if you're going by yourself and you don't know the elements of it, then you're exposing yourself and more so monetary damage if you don't know what you're doing. And if you do something that jeopardizes your earnest deposit, you may lose the money that you have tied up on this property. Well, I don't want to do that. I need representation. Because of that, I feel that I'm in a position of where I'm vulnerable. I'd rather go ahead and cancel. All right. Okay. So the buyer has the right to cancel during their due diligence period is because we try to see, and one of them is they don't have the means, but they still want to continue working with you. Then, we would go with that motion, right? Because on the first page of the BRBC, you checked off that the buyer agent cannot pay you, right? So that's one of the provisions that we're asking the seller for consideration. And if the seller comes back and says no to that, right, or an amount that I'm not comfortable with, right, then you and the buyer have to make that decision, right? The buyer, because you're representing the buyer. I hope that's kind of clear. Any thoughts, questions regarding that? Everyone's clear?
One more thing is that if you talk to the lender and let's say that they can qualify for more and they don't have any funds and it still is within the price of the appraisal value, you can always increase the price so they're going to be able to pay you your compensation.
Well, and I thank you, Rosie, for sharing. I would caution you with that. And I know it was a conversation we had here at the team meeting. You know, depending on the amount of money they're putting, if they're putting 50%, 40%, 30% down payment, then I think, because remember, they're financing your commission. You know, and if you're looking at a 30-year fixed loan, right? Imagine with $20,000 commission finance over or amortize over 30 years, that $20,000 commission can be $60,000, $80,000 in the minds of how you look at it in calculations because you're financing that amount. And any smart buyer would probably not want to do that. But to answer your question, yeah, some lenders may allow it if it's a substantial down payment. Your 3.5, your 5%, even maybe your 10% may not be able to qualify for something like that. But you know,
I didn't say the lender to finance. What I mean is, like, let's say, for instance, they qualify for 800, they are looking for 750 home, an example. And then the seller is not willing to pay for the commission. They could say, okay, yes, I don't know, maybe they finance, but they can say, okay, I'm going to increase my offer and then put, I don't know, $15,000 more or something like that, because they already qualify for $800,000.
yeah, and I've seen
Is
scenarios.
that also, but obviously the buyer have to be willing to do something like that.
Well, the buyer would have to be, but also the seller. But here's my concern with that, Rosie. Because we're increasing the amount and we're asking the seller that the difference, right, from the original offer to the new offer, you know, we're also asking the seller that that amount is going towards buyer's obligation to pay a commission, right? What if something happens down the line, right? And I'm just thinking worst case scenario, you know, that may jeopardize the loan, and the seller may say something to the nature where, well, you know, that amount is going to me. Now, how you protect yourself is obviously you want to put that in writing, right? And it has to be agreed upon by all parties on the intentions of what you're doing. As an example, let's say that you're going 750, right? But then you go, you know, 20,000 above 750, that puts you at 770? Okay. But we're also asking that the 770 price point, we're asking that the seller credit, because that ultimately is the seller, right? That's the offer. We're also asking the seller to credit us the 20,000 for buyer's obligation to pay commission to its agent, right? That's again something that you can, but most lenders, and again, it's one of those things that you really want to talk to a lender regarding that. But I've seen it when it comes to closing costs. I've seen that example, Rosie, where when it comes to concessions of closing costs, let's increase the amount so that way we can get the closing costs, right? And the seller is perfectly fine to do so, and they grant the increase with the 2% or the 3% back to the buyers for closing costs. And again, in looking at the the process of the entire concessions, right, it can go towards obligations to pay the agent as well. Okay, and I'll leave it at that. All right, so let's see, we have some. So pre-settlements and all commissions were included in the purchase price and usually finance buyer have always paid the commission. They're bringing money to the table. Yeah, you know, at the end, you're 100%. In order for the seller to consider any type of consideration, right? Even paying their listing agent their commission, It's really goes back to, you know, the buyer. The buyer has to bring in the means to be able to, for all this to work. So I completely understand. All right, so let's continue. All right, so if the seller has authorized the listing agent, okay, so let's go here. The advertisement of a seller concession on the MLS is only as invitation to offer. It is only expressed the seller willingness to consider such offer. It won't constitute a binding unilateral promise accordingly if the seller does receive an offer in which they are asked to pay the buyer broker. The seller is free to accept or counter it. The counter might offer to pay only a portion of the broker's compensation or credit, or these terms can be countered in its entirety. So remember, as I stated earlier, if we can come to an agreement that the seller is willing to pay some consideration of compensation, right? The buyer has to make the decision of what they're going to use that money for. Okay. So they can say, I'm going to break it into like a piece of pie. I want 1% to go towards my closing cost. I want 1% to go towards my buy down. And then the remainder 1%, right, of a total of 3% commission or percentage. And then the 1% to go towards my obligation to pay my agents, right? Obligation. And you can break it in that segue. Or we can use it where, you know, 2.5 goes to the agent, and then that 0.5% goes to my closing cost. However, the buyer wants to spin it is the way they have the right to do so, because they are obligated to pay you, not the agent anymore. Remember, before you used to negotiate with the agent, you know, and then the agent would, you know, fight and negotiate with the seller saying, okay, you know, we have it advertised for 2%, but the buyer's agent is asking 2.5. That's where we used to use the CBC form, the cooperating broker compensation agreement. Well, that form is no longer in existence. Okay. If the seller were to counter the buyer's request to cover their broker compensation, do they counter the compensation amount or do they counter the purchase price? Okay. Either one is perfectly fine. The seller may counter the purchase price or the seller may counter back to reduce the compensation. If the seller chooses to counter the compensation to the buyer's broker instead of the purchase price, then the counter should be specified by referencing the amount stated on the seller payment to buyer broker form SBPP. But there is no specific CAR form as of yet. Okay, so let me break it down for you. I submit an offer, right? And the offer is for 800,000. We're not asking for, the buyer's not asking for any type of credit for closing costs, right? But on the purchase agreement, they checked off G3, right? Saying, hey, you know, we're going to ask for compensation towards my obligation to pay my buyer's agent, right? You submit that request and you're requesting 3%. You submit the offer, right? The seller and the listing agent, it's all negotiations, right? The seller may say, look, I'm not okay with the price. Let's counter highest and best. Let's make sure that the buyer is putting additional earnest deposit. Maybe they just put 1%, but now the listing agent and the seller want you to put 3% earnest deposit, which is the maximum amount that a seller can go after for liquidated damages, right? They may be part of the condition. The other condition may be is close of escrow. We're not going to do 45 days. We want 30 days or less. And then the last one can be your commission under the SBPP form. You requested 3, we're only going to offer you 2. Okay. And then you send that counter to the buyer's agent. Buyer's agent is going to receive the counter offer. All right, Mr. Buyer, here's what we got. They want us to go highest and best. They want us to put an additional earnest of 3% of the total purchase price. They're asking us to reduce from 45 days to 30 days, but they're also asking us that the compensation that I put up 3% to be only 2%. Okay. All right. I want to stay at the same price. I don't want to go any higher. I'm okay increasing my deposit in escrow. So I'm okay with that. We can go ahead and put that on the counter. And I know that I have an obligation to pay you under the buyer representation agreement 3%. Are you okay, me as the agent, are you okay just accepting 2.5%? Because I don't want to pay additional if they're asking me to put additional earnest deposit. Yeah, I'm okay with the 2%, right? I'm okay. We can go ahead and go forward. But you can also ask the buyer to come in with the difference to pay you, right? If you have a 3% and the seller is paying you 2%, you can literally get commissions from both parties. The seller can pay you 2, the buyer can pay you 1, right? If as long as in the buyer representation agreement has a total of 3%. Now, I said earlier, if your amount is less than what the seller is willing to offer, then you need to modify that BRBC form to justify the amount higher. Otherwise, the seller is under no obligation to pay you the additional amount if they see a lower amount on your BRBC. Make sense? Okay. All right. So are sellers' concessions applied towards the total limit on lender caps? Okay. So this is going now to your question, I believe, Rosie. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA have indicated that they will exclude from the caps compensation paid to the buyer's broker by the seller, as in this case of a buyer requesting that the seller cover their obligations to the buyer broker using the SPBB form. So in essence, again, check with your lenders to make sure that it's in the up and up, right? Remember, there's other solutions to this, right? Solutions are this. If the seller is not willing to pay compensation, okay, you can't force them to pay. Then the buyer has to make a decision if they want to continue with this, if they don't have the means or the ability to pay you compensation. You can consider it as part of the process is to cancel and go find another property, right? That's option one. Option two is tell the buyer, look, unfortunately, I cannot represent you. There's no way I'm going to be liable without compensation. If we get into a lawsuit and I'm named in this, I have to pay a deductible if I get a claim under my insurance, right? So it wouldn't be to your best interest to represent someone that's not going to pay you, right? Think about this for a minute, right? If you were to consult with an attorney and the attorney wants to represent you, right? They're going to get paid, okay? In essence, they're not going to do it for free. Someone is going to have to pay. If it's the plaintiff, the person wanting to sue, or someone else for damages, that's the fair game. When it comes to our positions now, unfortunately, we're now in this new norm that we're requesting as part of our negotiations the ability for us to earn a commission. And if either party cannot or will not, then the buyer has to make a decision. You have the right to also terminate that agreement too with the buyer, and there's a form that you'll utilize for that purpose. Okay. Now, maybe the buyer says, look, I need you on this. Okay, I'm willing to pay you something. All right. Whatever that something is, it has to be worth you and what the value that you bring to the table, right? And if the buyer says, look, I'm okay, I can pay you 1.5%. Okay. Well, 1.5% of of 1 million may be still doable for you to continue with the process, right? It's your discretion at the end because remember, all commissions are all negotiable, and it says it in all of the forms: the purchase agreement, the listing agreement, the buyer representation agreement, and so on and so forth. There's going to be language there that says that. And going back, and then I'll end at that, is remember, when you have an agreement, it also includes the new MLS form. And it says about the compensation, right? It's all negotiable. It's now part of the process of negotiating. And, you know, in hopes that the seller and the listing agent will come back with a good results that will ultimately be in favor for you to, you know, open escrow and close the deal, right? But with all these new changes, you know, it's going to be an interesting time for sure. You know, once the dust settles, you know, we'll have a better way. And I have a feeling that even our car forms are going to have additional forms and how to navigate the new stuff going on. With that being said, that is the end of the presentation. I appreciate you all. Thank you. Any final questions or thoughts before we close out the session?
We need to read all the documents. That's the key too.
100%. Yep. Read
Thank you.
documents. And again, as always, I'm here if you have any specific questions that you have. And I appreciate you all for being on the call. We have a great participation on Zoom. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you on the next contract class.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now.